they have been doing right around in here if we could
Well,
be a fly on the wall here
we would
watching?
probably be standing right now when in what we kind of call the plaza area, or sort of an open communal area. The little Pueblo rooms were sometimes in a little arc around, and the general living area was actually outside of the rooms. And if you take a look at the reconstructions at the museum, you'll see how that plaza area is kind of the community focus for a Pueblo site. And when they did the reconstructions at the museum, they did that in the 1930s, and they used a lot of the excavation information that they had gathered and did that as just sort of a visual impression of what it was like 1,000 years ago in the valley.
And the adobe, then this is from the hills over there.
Well, it's actually from the valley floor. They probably would have gone down just right, the river is right behind us there, and they would have gone down and brought up the adobe clay from down there and carried water in pots to mix up the mud and then placed it on there. So yeah, it was a bit of work to build a house.
Well, then jumping forward 1,000 years or so, let's say, but to 1930 when they were excavating, you've got some great photographs in the museum of this CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps men working and looking pretty excited about what they were finding, getting some of those pots that were unbroken and the different things that they pulled out of the ground. You know, what was going on with them when they were here?
I imagine that would have been really exciting, especially for young men that were coming from all over the country. A lot of the men that worked here were actually from Ohio, and I had the opportunity to talk to a man who had worked on the project, and he said it was just very exciting in a whole different world from where he had been. But a lot of times in those excavations they did find whole pots or nearly whole vessels. So it would have been just an amazing time of discovery. We have artifacts in the museum, many whole pots and those kind of things that are priceless today. They're such an important piece of the past that, you know, to come to the museum and you can actually almost reach out and touch them, per se. You can actually see the fingerprints of the people that built the house 1,000 years ago. It's pretty amazing.
Wow.
For a little while, it was a tourist kind of a thing, and Union Pacific was involved at the time. There was a rail spur that came into the valley here, and there were special excursions. You could travel from Las Vegas for $1.50 and come out and see the fabulous Lost City, which were these Native American ruins in the valley here.
The pueblos here that you've got right here at the museum, Eva, are reconstructions then?
That's right. The reconstructed pueblos, these were actually done in the original museum building portion of the time frame. The Civilian Conservation Corps, again, they were creating displays, and the pueblos that you see here were built from the information that was gained in the excavations.
And they could figure out then how high the walls should be?
Well, some of the sites that they were excavating actually had a little bit more substantial wall than what we were looking at up there. So they had a good idea of what the floor plan was, and they knew where things like the interior hearths, the cooking area was. And these are recreated. They could see where some of the beams had fallen. And so these were recreated to give museum visitors at that time a visual impression of what life was like 1,000 years ago.
Well, I bet these particular things must be really popular for visitors.
Oh, everybody loves these. Kids of all ages love these. So a lot of people look at them, and I think some people are glad that they live now, and some people harken back to a simpler time, and maybe a little mud hut away from the Las Vegas Strip might be a fun place to be.
Coming up next, we'll return to the Lost City Museum, where the archaeological record has been carefully curated and presented for the public to learn about these ancient cultures. Welcome back. On this episode of Exploring Nevada, we are at the Lost City Museum in Overton, Nevada. This is a museum that was built around Anasazi ruins, and what we have been talking about is the Anasazi culture. Kathryne, this is an exhibit that is actually an archaeological...
It is actually an authentic site that was outside. We built the building around it in 1981 at that time to try and protect it somewhat, and we found that really didn't help too much. So what we did was set up the site as it would appear to an archaeologist who was coming upon the site, discovering it for the first time, laying out their grids to do their work, showing some of the tools that they would have used to do the excavation. We left one of the actual living floors open over here to show what an archaeologist finds at the bottom of the excavation. And then the last two rooms we covered over to show what the living floor would have been like when the people were actually living on it.
So the kinds of tools that were used in the 30s, let's say, when you were talking about the civilian corps doing their archaeological digs, was that pretty much very similar to what we have now? I mean, I see a shovel out there.
Right, pretty similar. Of course, technology has changed some of what archaeologists do, but the basic moving of the dirt is much the same as it was back then. We use shovels to take care of the overburden. As we get down into the finer work where we're trying to keep us stratigraphic levels, we go to trowels, paintbrushes, dental picks. They do use such things as backhoes in some sites, but probably not in a site like this where we have it defined and know where the rooms are.
Okay, and then it looks like you have some sort of drawing there.
Drawing, yes, that's a map. What we're trying to show here is that all archaeological work is scientific. It is not just coming out and digging up the ground and taking things out to look at. We actually, once a site is excavated, it's destroyed. And what we want to do is to be able to reconstruct that site on paper once we're done. And so everything that is done on the site is measured, both vertically up and down, how deep it is, but also from, as you can see the stakes here, we measure from those stakes horizontally so that everything could be mapped and put right back where it was on the map, because that site will never be there again.
Well, these people that we were talking about earlier were a farming culture.
Yes.
And so the valley out there certainly looks very lush, probably was several thousand years ago. What do you see in the dig that would tell you that they were a farming people?
The very first clue is that they were sedentary. They settled down here and they stayed here. And you can't stay in a place if there's not a food source. People prior to the Anasazi that lived in this area were what we call nomadic. They traveled. They went to the mountains when the pine nuts came into season. They were on the valley floors when the grasses were sprouting. As we do the excavations, we find seeds. We find seeds from the corn, the beans, squash. The pottery is a good indication that they were storing and cooking.
And so those pots there that we see there in this reconstructed kind of like a floor, it's very smooth there.
Right, yes.
That pottery, they were known for their pottery.
They are very well known for their pottery, and the Anasazi produced exquisite pottery both in the fineness of it and in the designs they put on it. It's some of the best pottery made, I think. The Virgin Anasazi, which is where we are, it's called the Virgin Branch because of the Virgin River north of us. They made really excellent, fine, thin, walled pottery.
Now, can people redo that? Or have there been attempts to make that same kind of pottery, and what kind of results did they get?
There have been, yes. There are people that are actually doing it the traditional way without the wheel. Of course, the Native Americans did not have the wheel.
How did they get it so rounded like that?
It's amazing. They did a coil method and scraped it down, but as you can see, the symmetry of it is perfect. The designs that are painted on them are perfect. It's just a skill.